Right, so good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar. Today, we'll be considering the science and practice perspectives of sphagnum planting in peatland restoration. And we've got a great lineup of speakers here from across the UK today, and I'd like to extend all of them our thanks for presenting. So just a quick bit of housekeeping from me. I've just put up the outline of the webinar on the screen. As you can see, we have 4 speakers today, each giving a 15-minute talk, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Our speakers will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you on our YouTube channel. But please note that the Q&A session will not be recorded. We have a large audience today, and therefore we have disabled the chat function, and we ask that you put questions in the Q&A box. And could you please also include the name of the speaker to whom your question is addressed to, so that we can direct the questions more efficiently. The Q&A box should be visible to all of you, so if you would like to see any particular questions answered, then please upvote them. And if you have questions for the IUCN UK Peatland programme, please forward those directly to our contact email, which we will share at the end of the session, and we will follow up with you directly. So without further ado, I will now hand over to our first speaker, Tim Parfitt from Beadamoss. So Tim, if you're ready to share your screen, would you like to kick off the webinar, please?
Yes, thank you very much. So hopefully that's working for all of you.
Looks good.
Oh, brilliant. Right. So hi, everyone. My name's Tim Parfitt. I'm the General Manager of Beadamoss. Here to talk to you about all the work that we do regarding the micropropagated sphagnum that gets planted across all the sites that you guys talk about. So we're a horticultural company. We employ 40 staff now. We're based in the Midlands. We supply mostly to all across the UK, but we also have quite a lot of customers over in Ireland and increasingly in Germany. And we produce 6 million of these plugs per year now. So that's these hummocks up here. And then we dispatch them out in these rolls of 20, and they get planted up individually, and they turn into these lovely little plants down here in the bottom right-hand corner. In terms of what we do, so we have 3 acres under glass, and everything we do is underpinned by environmental sustainability. So we run a highly controllable environment, which ensures that we produce a quality product time and time again, and it's very reliable so that we get the best results out in the real world. Over the years, we've had a lot of different iterations, improving the reliability and establishment. So we started life off in beads, hence the name Beadamoss. They were fantastic to spread by air, but they were quite vulnerable to being washed off exposed areas if there was heavy rainfall, and it's typically those exposed areas that we're looking to restore first. So we moved over to a gel type system, which was susceptible to drying out as it's suspended by the natural vegetation out there. So if we had a dry spell, as we are having this season, it was quite susceptible. So that's why we've then moved over to these hummocks. Now, these are a little slower to plant, but actually because they're more resilient, and you can plant them in, you only have to go to site once. So it's actually the best option in the long run to go forward. And we've produced about 17 million to date now, and we're not looking back on that. In terms of how we actually produce them, so at the very, very start of the process, we'll be sent a sample, possibly from a new location or a new customer, and that sample can be as small as 3 strands, each a couple inches long. That's all we require. We clean it up and we remove any debris, any bacteria, any fungus, and then in-house we identify what that species is. A sample then gets sent off to a third party to verify what that species is again. And then that's when it moves into the laboratory, which sort of where the magic happens really. And we multiply it up using micropropagation techniques. And we have various different stages along the process in terms of bulking it up, depending on how soon we need it. And we have full traceability within that system. And at each stage, we review what we've got in front of us and it's of suitable quality and its age before it then moves on to the next stage. And it's that micropropagation process that turns the plant into a juvenile state. And that's where the rapid growth comes from. So it's essentially the same principle as why a baby is growing much faster than a 37-year-old bloke. Um, and we have full traceability throughout the whole system, which sort of underpins everything we do. Now, as a result of that, one of the benefits is it has a greater ability to photosynthesize. So this is a PhD study by Anna from Manchester Metropolitan University. And in her study, she was looking at 6 different species, comparing micropropagated material versus wild source material. And you can see in each of these, the blue box is the Beadamoss material exceeding the wild harvested material in terms of its ability to photosynthesize. So it just has a greater ability, if the environment's right, to outgrow the equivalent wild material. Now, something that's overlooked quite a lot is that these hummocks aren't a monospecies, they're actually quite a broad mix. So if we were to be producing, say, a IUCN Scottish mix, for example, we'd have our species that I've just labeled A to F here. We typically have half a dozen to a dozen different species, and they'll be in different proportions. And we know that the correct proportions go in at the start of our system, so when we plant it. And also, a lot of our customers will do environmental studies once they've been planted at different time stages. And we know that over time there is a bit of an evolution in terms of what species colonizes, but we know at the very start that they are the proportions we'd expect. And that feedback's really important for us because we know that at each end of the process, uh, the crop is expecting, it's behaving how we would expect. Now, within that, whilst we plant it, we will test each individual species for their viability as a double check. As you can imagine, that once they get planted as a mix, it's very difficult to identify if there had been a problem that we hadn't noticed. Here's a bit of a snapshot of our typical mixes or our sort of more popular mixes. We don't want to be introducing material that's being supplied from one part of the country into another part of the country. So if you look along the top here, we've got Scottish mix, Irish mix, for example. And on the left-hand side, if you go about halfway down, we've got palustry. So we have around 40 potential sources of palustry alone, so 40 different locations. So the Scottish mix will be using a Scottish palustry. The Irish mix will be using an Irish palustry. And on top of that, from one year to the next, we ensure that we use a different clone. So the Scottish palustry made this year is from a different source to the one that last year and will be different to what we use next year as well. And on top of that, another layer of safety is that we don't produce all of our mixes in one big go. So we stagger them to meet the demands of the customer. And then by storing them, that gives us an opportunity to then mix up the different batches as well. So that if there was a particular batch that had a problem that no one had noticed or something had happened to it and went unnoticed, we're then reducing the risk for our customer as well. But the important thing is we can trace what has been sent to each customer. So if there's any problem, again, we can go through our records and find out where they all came from and who had what. Big question is, why do we go to all that effort? Essentially, this picture sort of sums it up. You can see here in the foreground, it's clearly more exposed. It's slightly higher, so it's going to be quite exposed to the sunshine and probably the wind. And over on the left-hand side, we've got this really boggy condition. Now, that might be a bog for a couple of days. It might just be boggy for a few hours after a rainfall event. And on the right-hand side, we've got this highly vegetated area. Within that mix of 6, 10, 12 plants, there's going to be a couple species in there that thrive, that really like those particular conditions, whether it got planted in the vegetated area or the bog condition or the exposed condition. And that just means that something in there, a couple of those species are going to absolutely thrive and colonize that area. And that's what we're really interested in. We want to have rapid results so that we have the environmental benefits as quickly as possible. Now, this is a trial conducted by Moors for the Future. Um, Me and Tom, another speaker, went to collect the latest results for the data. And I think if we hadn't both been out there, we probably wouldn't have believed the results because of the difference in growth. So this is simply looking at a comparison of a monospecies of wild source material, as you would find on the moors, that's been translocated to a new site, versus our beta hummocks, which is micropropagated and a mix of species. And we're not saying that translocation doesn't work. All the areas had grown, and some of them have done quite well. It's just showing the rate of growth when you get everything lined up. So you have that mix and you have that juvenile state. And the faster growth simply means we're preventing floodwater getting into the system quicker. We're preventing CO2 emissions being lost quicker. And we're providing a habitat for other plants and animals quicker. And if you're being grant funded, also you're looking for results quicker because we can't be waiting 10, 20, 30 years to see some decent results. Now, in addition to this, there's a report that's going to come out. It's not published yet, so I didn't want to take that limelight. But it's a customer of ours that's compared a monospecies hummock that we've made for them versus a mix. And again, this is the results are basically showing that a mix does better. And I think that previous slide just explains why. And it's good to see and really excited to read the report when it comes out. But it's not wholly unsurprising, but it is nice to see that it does happen. Now we even go to lengths of testing how we supply the material. So we used to send them out in these wraps of plastic. So we produce 6 million hummocks. They go in rolls of 20, so that's 300,000 potential pieces of plastic floating around the moorlands, which is the last thing we want. And the best will in the world, the contractors are not going to be able to gather every single piece. Inevitably, some are going to get lost and be out there in the wild. Unfortunately for storage, plastic's fantastic because it doesn't degrade. It's essentially inert, and we had really good storage options with that. We can't be using plastic because it doesn't fit with what we're trying to achieve. So we moved over to paper. But if you're moving over to paper, you have to really consider what's in it. So if we were using white paper, there'd be bleaches in there. You have to think about what the binding agents, the glue, how it's going to behave when it starts breaking down, whether that's going to be detrimental to the moss. So we do all these trials in the background before we even supply it to the customer. We do know that the paper does break down, but it doesn't actually harm the sphagnum in any way. It is considerably more expensive, and we don't really want to be shortening the shelf life of the product or increasing costs, but we just feel that we have to in terms of the mission that we're fighting for, and it goes against everything using plastic. And I suppose our biggest headache is that none of these benefits can be achieved if we don't supply plants in the best possible health. So we have a highly controllable environment, but there is a limit to that control. So we start the plants off in a nice warm conditions, and then they go into a more traditional greenhouse. So we can turn all the heating off and we can open the vents. But a day like today, they are still growing. So there's a limit to how long we can keep the plants on the beds before they have to be harvested to be dispatched. If we left them for too long, they wouldn't go through our machinery. Contractors would have difficulty planting them, just the physical handling of them. And we think that they would be less resilient because they wouldn't be nice, short, dense, compact plants. They'd be a bit more leggy and a bit more susceptible to drying out in the wind and in the sunshine. So they have to get harvested. At that point, they then get put into cold storage. And because we're dealing with plants, they are not going to improve in cold storage. They can only go backwards. So even though they sort of go into a stasis, we want to keep hold of them for as little time as possible before they then get planted out onto the moorland. And that's where the challenge is of us balancing our production of having to grow them over the course of 6 months and then passing them on to our customers who have to plant them. They have contractors, they have to battle with the weather conditions, there can be hold-ups, there can be breakdowns. They're all very difficult issues that we sort of have to navigate as one, and communication is key. But for us, that's the really difficult bit. We've done all this hard work and our customers are lined up to take them, but for whatever reason, a planting date gets moved. We have to keep the plant for a little bit longer. It wants to be outside on the moorlands growing so it can then produce all these fantastic benefits. Um, so that's our biggest challenge. But fortunately, we have a good core sort of partners that we work with that know their stuff, and I'm sure we're going to hear from them. And at that point, it's then down to everyone else once they leave the gates. So at that point, I'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. So I will quickly hand over to our next speaker, Anthony Blundell from the University of Leeds.
Hello. Can people see that? Yeah.
Not yet.
Hold on 1 second. Don't see that. There we go. That.
Yeah, perfect.
Right, great. Okay, good morning. My name is Anthony Blundell from Leeds University. And this morning, I'm going to talk to you about paleoecological surveys and Digibog Hydro and how they can potentially be a complementary tool to inform peatland remediation work, including about what the whole conference is about, sphagnum planting as part of that. Below here, we have a list of the people who've been involved in this. Myself, Dylan Young, Martin Gilpin, Andy Baird, Joe Holden, and Robin Gledhill, all from Leeds University. Okay, so why am I mentioning things about paleoecological surveys here? Well, if you're thinking about what you're going to do on your site in terms of sphagnum planting or other things, restoration type things, peatlands clearly are something that is an archive that has a lot of information in about how the place is developed. And through paleoecological measures, you can try and reconstruct that development and see how the peatland has developed. You can do that in a catchment-wide sense in a survey, which I'll talk about in a bit, or in a more traditional sense, in a single sort of detailed, highly detailed single point in the peatland analysis, which is the more sort of traditional way of looking at these things. And why would you do that? Well, there's the potential, it's not prescriptive, but there's the potential to show a guide, if you like, to some sort of restoration targets that you might think about. There's potential to support remediation actions that you're thinking of, may well not support them as well, of course. And certainly with the spatial surveys, there is the possibility of deriving and highlighting spatial variability across your site. Because despite the fact that these places often now look very, very similar, they've not developed necessarily in the same way through time across the entire site that you're looking at. Another good thing about these paleoecological surveys and analyses is they're really good at trying to engage citizens and foster appreciation of the environment. And it highlighted here context. I think that's one of the biggest things paleo type stuff can give any sort of management to people, is the context as to what the place has been through, how it's developed, and what you might think about going forward. So traditionally, the sort of things you might see for paleo analysis is this sort of thing, which is an analysis from Keithley Moore that I did in 2015. This was a very useful analysis at the time for Yorkshire Water, their site at Keithley, because it was able to show from a single core analysis for macrofossils here, this is previous vegetation, it was able to show that sphagnum had been a good part of the development of this site, and then very recently, in the last 100 years or so, had become pretty rare, if not non-existent, for various reasons due to burning, pollution, etc., etc. So that was very useful. And with that macrofossil clearly you can look at vegetational history, you can look at vegetational response to burning, climate change, and other types of damage. Obviously, you can date that as well to see when those timing of those things happened, and potentially use that data to think about your restoration targets and tailor them. And also, importantly, assess the present state of your site as to how it's been in the past. So paleo stuff's not all about macrofossils. There's all sorts of things you can do. Another popular thing that people do is test the amoeba to look at water table reconstructions, and also more recently it's been used to look at how the ecological health of a site has changed, often post-restoration as well. Okay, but something I've been trying to push recently is more spatial type surveys, so work done actually in the field. So these pictures here are of some work I've been doing with volunteers at Marsden Moor with the National Trust. And this site, this map here is the map of the Marsden estate, and all those dots are core locations where a core has been looked at in the field and data has been taken. So I'm not going to dwell on the results of this too much. I'll show you a small part of it in a bit. Okay, so what do we do in these spatial stratigraphy surveys? Well, first of all, as you're there, you might as well record the surface vegetation. So we'll do that first. Look at Troll-Smith assessments down a core. So Troll-Smith, if you're not aware, is basically a way of looking at the constituents of what makes up the peat in terms of previous vegetation. Record the charcoal levels that you can see in the field, and also record von Post, which is a humidification measure, which I'm sure most of you will know. And on top of that, actually retrieve some samples from the sections that you find in the cores that you look at. So you're not doing a massive detailed analysis like you might have done traditionally, or a much more lower detail, but still useful data for management purposes going forward. So what can you do with that? Well, obviously you'll get peat depth clearly from doing the survey, which is useful for carbon stocks. You'll get a peat composition estimate, which is important in terms of what the prevalence of sphagnum has been on the site and other bog species. You'll be able to see changes in burning regime and changes in decomposition. And some of those decomposition measures like von Post can be used as a proxy for other things. Clearly, there are caveats in the field data in that level of accuracy that exists, but retrieving samples from the cores and carrying that and doing a bit more in the lab adds to the accuracy of your survey. This is just an example from a paper in 2015 of where this was done, or part survey was done at Keighley Moor. On this site, the green dots are places where cores were taken, and the size of the green dots in this map, top map, is basically the prevalence of sphagnum in the top 30 centimeters, so in the recent past. So if there's a big circle, it means that sphagnum made up a reasonable amount of peat in the recent past, whereas a small circle made absolutely no, there was no presence of it at all. And then in the bottom map here, you have the same thing, but repeated for the most recent peat in the top 5 centimeters. And you can see from that survey the big drop off in sphagnum prevalence in time from this state to this state. And importantly, the hatched areas are where sphagnum planting was carried out in the last few years. And based on the sort of paleo data, there is crossover here in these areas. But if armed with this data again, you'll wonder whether you would still use your time planting in these areas. I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't, but it may well be useful evidence to try and concentrate your activity based on the evidence from the paleo work. Okay, so we've also been doing these stratigraphy surveys, started doing them at a place called Darwin, a moorland up there in Lancashire. You see it here, it's very close to urban areas near Manchester, Preston, Blackburn. It's a big area of blanket peat with ongoing remediation measures. This has been done together with Lancashire Peat Partnership. And the bit that we've been sort of focusing on is Wilding Brook. Again, a lot of remediation measures are going on here at the moment. Sphagnum planting has not started yet, as far as I'm aware. We're carrying out this survey to try and help guide and give an idea of how maybe planning should go forward in the future. So the dots here represent areas that are to be cored. The ones that are in red have been cored. So we've got to go about a quarter of the way through at the moment. We can see from these black shadows, these all represent areas of gullies or grips. So the place is very, very heavily influenced by man and grips and gullies. So just to show you a few results from the initial sort of work here, you can get these basically stratigraphy transects that gives you a 3D view of how the peat has developed. This has been applied with PPSP. This is a program I made myself recently that's in review. So if anyone's interested in producing diagrams like this, let me know. So this is a diagram of the cores highlighted in these turquoise circles here across this deeper part. And what you have here is Troll-Smith names, which are in Latin, which is probably not useful for presentation, but in terms of what you need to know, the green is basically sphagnum, the yellow is basically sedge, which on this side is mainly Erophorum vaginatum, and this sort of sandy type colour is decomposed peat. So they're the things you really need to know. And these cores are split into sections, so each one of these is 25%, as with what the Troll-Smith scheme sort of dictates. There's all these different sections. So you can start to see, as you go across this deep area, the sort of influence of sphagnum, or at least what's left in these cores of sphagnum in each one of these cores. And next to it is the von Post data here in this column, and also some charcoal records that we saw in the field. So that just gives you a general idea of what's happened across that deep area. But then we can go in and look at the samples in there and actually start to see what sphagnum it was in those areas of sphagnum, and also in the sort of sedge areas, what was dominating. And again, here, this is Turfa lignosa, so sort of shrubby material. You can go in and see what that was. And this charcoal layer here, just a picture of charcoal. So you can start to build up an idea of how the site has developed in this way. And on this particular site, you've got some really nice, well-preserved, big section sphagnum, which again actually highlights how spatially different this site is, because it's not located everywhere. It's in really sort of pockets around and about. Okay, so just summing up on the old paleo spatial surveys. A lot of people think they have to be really expensive. They don't have to be really expensive. Traditional sort of detailed analysis can be, because of time intensiveness. But spatial surveys don't have to be expensive, because you're not necessarily spend quite so much time. But the data you get is still useful for management, in my opinion. And with training, as we've done with the National Trust volunteers, can be carried out in conjunction with volunteers, but best to be overseen at least by someone who's highly experienced. Okay, so moving on from that, just briefly, depending on how much time I've got, I'm just going to talk quickly about Digibog Hydro, as this is something I've been working on a lot recently. So Digibog Hydro is a hydrological model, which you may or may not have heard of, created by Andy Baird, Dylan Young and Paul Morris at Leeds. It basically allows you to model water tables across peatland for up to about a year in time, and is driven by data such as rainfall, potential evapotranspiration, peak depth, DTMs, hydraulic conductivity, and drainable porosity. So why am I telling you about some of that exists? Well, because there's new things going on with it, and I've basically been involved in developing it to try and be much more user-friendly to those outside academia by creating, and I'm still doing so, a GUI in Python, and refining the processes as to how data is used and collated in order to be used within the model, and then how it is viewed by the user at the end point, and hopefully to produce data that is usable, more usable than maybe what an academic might want out of it. So this is just a picture of the welcome screen for the model, and just another screen showing you somewhere where you can display some outputs from the model. So it's basically what the GUI sort of looks like. There's lots more screens in there, and there's lots more to come that needs to be done. So what can it do and what will it do? Well, it can model your water table depths across Peatland. It can provide graphical and tabular outputs for each time step and transects across particular features. And it will eventually be able to provide summary outputs for a year or whatever specified period you want. Also, this needs development, but you can, to an extent at the moment, model some installations such as dams, ponds, and reprofiling. And at the moment, you can apply it to areas of around 2 by 2 kilometers at 1 meter resolution. Beyond that, the file sizes are getting extremely large, and your sort of common office computer will probably start to struggle. So what? So what indeed? Well, what you can do with it, and what is important, I think, from management terms, is you can highlight areas based on the water table data that may well be highest priority in terms of remediation action. You can also potentially test some areas in terms of the potential actions you might take before you do them to see how useful they're going to be, and also possibly inform the planning of sphagnum planting based on the fact that you'll have a theoretical water table change through the year, and you'll be able to see the sort of range it fluctuates in. Okay, so I'm just going to show you very quickly now a little bit of some of the outputs from a small area of Buckstones moss. So in this square that's highlighted here. So in that square, the green squares here, I actually say we've done this paleo thing across the estate, and the green squares here are where sphagnum has been a significant part of the previous history of the site. And every single one of those squares now at the surface does not have or didn't have sphagnum at the time of survey. So as a management person, you would say, well, I've definitely got a good mandate here to try and bring sphagnum back to this place because it was a very important part of this square of peatland here. So, but you might think, well, it was very important, but can the hydrology support it? That's the point. Well, this GIF here, which is now running sort of halfway through, is based on 2015 real rainfall and temperature data, and showing the water table change in this square as we go along. And you can see the water tables from 0 to on the scale 120 here. And as it scrolls through, you can start to see areas that are particular levels of drawdown. We're going into winter now, so everything's looking blue. But you'll see it on the next slide where that's a bit better. So it's sometimes difficult to see a little bit on this where things are changing. So we've tried to do some different things, and we'll continue to do different things. Well, this is a wetness index that possibly does a bit of a, excuse me, look at that in a second, does a better job at highlighting the worst areas in terms of drawdown. So the red is the drier areas and the blue the wet. So clearly around the gullies it's getting drier, so no surprise there as such, but some much more than others. And also the areas in between the gullies, once you start to smooth this very complicated data out, you'll start to get patches that are much more stable and less stable in terms of water table. So you can also look at transects, which is what this thing is doing here, this figure. And this is an example of a transect across where this red line is on this figure here. But this is where we've actually put a block in. So it's actually, that's why the surface in gully is high. It's the level of the block. And as the year's going on, you can see how it's affecting the water table in the immediate zone either side. So last thing to say, there's a lot of development to do on this. And actually, it'd be really good to get input from practitioners in terms of what would be useful for them to get out of it at the other end, if they view it as useful in the first place. I envisage creating some summaries related to vegetation water table tolerances, which may well be useful, relating the water tables to greenhouse gas emissions, running with some future year climate scenarios, and it needs a lot more development in terms of making it easier to try and test and restoration measures in the way it's set up and such. Right, that's it.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for an excellent talk. Just a quick reminder for everyone to please put any questions you may have into the Q&A box, and please also let us know which speaker your question is addressed to. So I will now quickly hand over to our next speaker, Tom Spencer from Moors for the Future.
Hi there. Right, let me share my screen if I can get the right bit. Okay. Right. So if I do that, are we seeing my first slide there?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. So yeah, my name's Tom Spencer. I'm from Moors for the Future Partnership. I work on the science team there, but I'm going to be talking today about the practical considerations around sphagnum planting. So we've heard a bit about how the sphagnum is produced. We've heard a bit about sort of the context for some of the kind of sites where we might be looking to plant it. And I'm going to talk about where we choose to plant sphagnum and actually how do we plant it. And when do we plant it, and then a bit about the resilience. So does it work? Is it possible? And then resilience to things like drought and wildfire and climate change. Okay, so starting with where do we plant? This is the work area of Moors for the Future. So Peak District, South Pennines, surrounded by large conurbations. And as I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of degraded peat in our work area, and a wide range of issues at each different site, which may need fixing, which can include lack of sphagnum where we think sphagnum should be, but also other issues to do with kind of loss of vegetation or erosion or gullying, gripping, that kind of thing. In terms of where we choose to plant sphagnum, one of the key things is funding. We need money to buy and plant the sphagnum, and funding may be available through different streams, grant providers, etc. And that can affect which sites are available to plant on. Also, land ownership issues can come into that. We have done a lot of sphagnum planting already. So the green areas on this map are areas where we've done at least some sphagnum planting. So you can see it's kind of throughout our whole work area, but there's a lot of space that we haven't planted on also. I mentioned funding before. Funding dictates the density of planting often. So the standard density of planting we think is too low. We're not planting it at high enough density to fully restore these sites. And that's because of funding. So that's something that we're pushing to try and change, is to increase what we accept as the standard density of planting. So quite a few of the sites that are on here as being planted are sites that we might want to go back to and bump up the density, basically. So where do we plant on an individual site? Once we've chosen the site, sphagnum planting will be one of the things that we do on the site, but it's very rarely the only thing that we do. So we'll do a bunch of surveying and planning before we do anything. And that will include desk-based surveys from satellite imagery, and also going into the field and seeing what needs doing. This is a hideously complicated map, which works much better if you have control of it and can isolate the layers on it. But the point is, we're doing a lot of different things to sort out the various issues that might be there on any given site. So we'll be doing some reprofiling of gully edges. We'll be doing some gully blocking using a range of different materials. If there's bare peat, we'll be revegetating that. We might be doing some management of dominant header stands. We might be planting a range of different vascular plants as well as sphagnum. We might be doing some surface bunding. So all sorts of different things. And where we plant the sphagnum is affected by the site conditions. So some areas we might consider to be too dry and there's nothing we can do about that, so we're just not going to plant there. Some areas might be too dry at the moment, but if we do some remedial works first, we might be able to sort out the hydrology in those spaces so we can then plant the sphagnum. So it's a sort of holistic approach to any given site, and sphagnum fits into that. And yeah, so this is the kind of situation that we might be dealing with. Luckily, not so much anymore in the uplands because most of the extensive bare peat has been revegetated now. But this is kind of what we started with. And sphagnum ultimately is not going to grow if we plant it into those conditions. So on a site like this, we need to do a bunch of work first before we can consider sphagnum planting. But I can tell you that this site has now been planted with sphagnum following various other remediation works. So it is possible, even from a quite bleak starting point. But yeah, there might be some intensive works to do first. So that would be things like restoring the hydrology. Where we've got gullies, we'll block them. And like I said, with a range of different materials. So that can turn something like this into something a bit more like that. And so now we've got pools of standing water, the margins of which will support sphagnum growth. And we can also plant into the pools using the aquatic mix, which flashed up on one of Tim's slides earlier. So things can be done. On sites where we don't have extensive gullying or between large gullies, there might be lowered water tables on relatively flat ground. We can still re-wet them using techniques like bunding. So this is a site where we're doing some monitoring at the moment. You can see various water table and vegetation survey infrastructure there. This is to monitor the effects of bunding. So we put in a bund there. And now you can see that we've got standing water. So that's going to accelerate sphagnum growth and support sphagnum through the year when it might get drier in the summer and that kind of thing. So restoring hydrology is key. So we get the conditions right, and then the sphagnum will go for it. So moving on to how do we plant? So with this, you can tell that this is an old picture because the sphagnum is in plastic, which doesn't happen anymore. It's in the paper that Tim was talking about. But essentially, we as Moors for the Future have overseen a lot of sphagnum planting from these hummocks, so beader hummock, and so they come in these rolls. And this year, so 2024 to 25, this sort of winter work season, Moors for the Future contractors, volunteers, and staff planted 2,466,166 of these plugs. Majority of that was contractors, simply because there's just so much of it that we are planting. So we're doing this at pace and at scale across a large area. So it's a big operation, and kind of Tim talked about the process of getting it to our door. We then have to get it out into the landscape. So it's quite a big operation. When do we plant? So this is the ideal planting conditions. You can see everyone's having a great time there. So ideally when it's wet, because that's what sphagnum likes. Early in the season, so the planting season is October to March, outside of ground nesting bird season essentially. So early in the season, so we've got a good chunk of wet weather before any dry periods in the spring and summer, but realistically we have to plant up until the 31st of March, which is when our consents run out for ground nesting bird season. Just because we're planting so much of it. So we do have to plant in good weather as well, unfortunately. So we've found that even if we do end up planting in March and then we get a dry spring, I'm looking out the window and seeing a dry spring at the moment, sphagnum is surprisingly resilient. So this was April 2019, 1 month after planting. We did get a dry spring that year. And then a few months later, in September of that year, the sphagnum is very much still there and has grown pretty well. So even if they do get a dry spring, they're surprisingly resilient. Okay, so sphagnum reintroduction, is it possible? You can see this is quite a degraded peatland, but we've done some gully blocking. Where it's wet in the bottom and we've planted sphagnum, it really, really does love it. So where it's wet, the sphagnum will really go for it, even in quite degraded sites. And following on from some of the graphs that Tim showed, we've done a bit of monitoring of survival rates. We've found that 90% of Beada hummock plugs that we've planted have survived. We've only done that monitoring on bare peat sites, so we can't talk about sites that we haven't done bare peat revegetation on, but that's a pretty good survival rate. And this shows that while, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the steeper line is sphagnum growth in stream flow pathways, so in wet areas, and the lower line is with the circles, that is on hill slopes, so slightly drier conditions but still growing really well. So sphagnum will grow really quite fast in wet spaces, but it will also grow successfully in the drier conditions. We've looked a bit at growth rates in sites dominated by single species of vascular plants. So we've got heather, cotton grass and purple moorgrass, and sphagnum has grown at all of those. It's definitely slowest at Millennia, probably because it's getting shaded out, but it's growing surprisingly well at the heather site. So we planted it intentionally into dense heather, which might be considered unsuitable for sphagnum growth, but it's actually done really well there. So yeah, this kind of juvenile Beada hummock plug planting is really quite successful. Okay, so resilience. I've talked a bit about planting the plugs and then the plugs then getting a dry spring and surviving that. We've also looked at wildfire. It's quite hard to study wildfire because you don't know where it's going to happen. But as it happened, we set up some sphagnum monitoring at Marsden Moor just before it burned. So we planted 3 different mixes of sphagnum into Marsden Moor in March 2019. In April 2019, there was a big wildfire there, which burnt through our sphagnum planting trial. You can see the fire wiped out pretty much all of the vegetation that had been there. But the sphagnum, while it was pretty desiccated, was still present. And this is something that we've seen at other sites where there have been wildfires, is that while the bryophyte layer might in general be completely wiped out, so your feather mosses, cushion mosses completely burnt out, we still find little hummocks of sphagnum, probably because they're little pockets of wet material. So that's a map of the burn sky. You can see it burnt through all of the Yorkshire mix, all of the Moorland mix, and some of the chunky mix. And we went back and surveyed the sphagnum in 2024. And we found that all 3 mixes had grown considerably since then. The one which burnt the least did grow the fastest, that's the chunky mix. But the other 2, which were completely burnt in the fire, were not only still present, but they had grown well, which was quite remarkable, really. 236 out of the 240 plugs that we planted in that trial were found in April 2019. So we're still present after the fire, despite only being 1 month old at the time of the fire. Okay, so resilience to climate change. So there is some research that's coming out at the moment, which is suggesting that the UK climate may not support sphagnum and or blanket bog in the future under current climate change predictions. It's obviously quite alarming and of great concern to all of us. What we observe is that where we have planted sphagnum, it's proving so far surprisingly resilient to drought. So we had those images of the sphagnum bouncing back after a drought straight after planting. We've seen that across our sites. And just from looking at sites, so the image on the left is a bare peat site where we've done no restoration work at all. You can see there's cracking in the peat. peat turns to dust when it's dry, it blows away in the wind, it washes away in the rain. That is clearly very vulnerable to climate change. On the right, we've got an area where we've got dense sphagnum. In places, the sphagnum that we've planted here is around 30 centimetres deep down to the peat surface. That is 10 years after planting. That 30 centimetres of wet material we observe to be not only protecting itself, so it bounces back after a drought because the surface might desiccate, but the sphagnum lower down is still holding a lot of moisture, so it's going to bounce back. But it's also protecting the peat underneath, so it's providing some resilience to the peat. So while none of us can actually know for sure what's going to happen in the future, we think that really going for it with restoration, accelerating our efforts, doing more re-wetting, doing more sphagnum planting at higher density across more of the landscape is probably our best shot at improving the resilience of these landscapes to climate change. So if any of these sites are going to survive as blanket bog under climate change future scenarios, it's probably going to be the ones that are in the best condition. So yeah, our approach is to accelerate our restoration efforts rather than give up, essentially. So we do have a bunch more questions. There's a lot of things that we don't know about sphagnum planting. So which species mix? Tim had, I can't remember how many, 8 mixes or something. Some of those are geographic, obviously. Some of them are to do with different conditions. We haven't done, and we're not aware of other trials that have done specific comparisons of different species mixes and their growth rates in the same conditions. So we're looking at comparing some of the mixes at our sites, see which ones are most suitable to which conditions. We're playing around a bit with the size of plugs that we're planting. We think that if we plant bigger plugs, they might be more resilient to early droughts. And we're wanting to sort of push the boundaries a little bit with what we consider to be too dry to plant, because some of our plugs that have been planted in pretty dry conditions, not on hagtops, and they are still there and they are growing, albeit slowly. So we'll find out how dry is too dry. And another question is, how deep does the peat need to be? So there's an idea that you can't plant sphagnum onto shallow peat because it won't grow. You can only plant it onto deep peat. But we want to know whether that's actually the case. We think it's probably more to do with how wet the peat is. So there's going to be a correlation between how deep the peat is and how wet it is, but it's not just about that. So yeah, we've got a trial looking at whether we can establish sphagnum on shallow peat as well. So yeah, there are lots of things that we don't know. There are some things that we do know that I've gone through in this talk. So thanks for listening. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Tom. If you have any questions for Tom or any other speakers today, please pop them in the Q&A box. And we will now be moving on to our final speaker of the day, Richard Lindsay from the University of East London. So Richard, when you're ready.
Great, thanks, Helen. Hopefully you can see more holes than Blackburn, Lancashire.
Looks good.
Good, right. Yeah, I've actually been scribbling madly during those presentations because there's a number of points that I was keen to highlight anyway. And essentially, those various presentations, all really interesting, have helped to highlight the fact that these points are really important. There's sorry, just there we go. I'm just going to highlight some research which was carried out a long time ago, but appears to have been lost or forgotten, but which has direct relevance to what people have been talking about today and the issues that we're concerned with. And essentially that there are 2 parameters that I'm keen to highlight that I feel we're not taking into consideration sufficiently at the moment. The first one is soil moisture. The second is precipitation. And hopefully I'll explain what I mean by that. But I would recommend to everybody this book by Smith, Bryophyte Ecology, and specifically Chapter 8, The Ecology of Sphagnum. There is so much that is of real importance to understanding how sphagnum behaves in this chapter. So I'm going to be shamelessly drawing from this chapter at various points during this presentation. So, sphagnum, an unusual moss. There's no other moss that has this kind of structure. The important points about it are firstly that it grows from the apex, and then the rest of the plant is retained as structural and functional elements until eventually the lower part dies. There are, however, apical buds in the axils of these what are called spreading branches. And then in addition to the spreading branches, we have these what are called pendant branches. Both of these branches have important functions. The spreading branches enable adjacent plants to exchange moisture with each other. The pendant branches replace what in higher plants will be the vascular tissue that transmits photosynthetic material or water up and down the plant. These pendant branches act like the xylem, so water transport. And these can raise water up to the growing tip up to 30 centimeters. So that's a really important point in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of keeping this growing tip alive and healthy in whatever peat matrix the plug has been inserted. Different sphagnum species use these functions to greater or lesser extents. So species such as Sphagnum capillifolium, Sphagnum fuscum, Sphagnum austinii will rely very much on these pendant branches to bring moisture as much as 30 centimeters from deep in the peat up to the growing apical bud. Species such as Sphagnum cuspidatum, so essentially aquatic species, really don't rely on this at all. They rely on just being immersed in the water matrix. So they're really quite poor at being able to transmit moisture up to the apex. So that's the first point. The nature of the species you're using will influence just how resilient it is to being in essentially a dry environment, but which has moisture deeper in the peat, which can be drawn on. So I mentioned the apical buds, and that's often the reason that we find double or even triple-headed sphagnums, because the apical bud may have been damaged perhaps by fire. And so we then have two axillary buds, which will then go on to develop two new heads. So these axillary buds are quite really important in terms, again, in terms of resilience. And so the sort of thing that Tom was talking about in relation to recovery from the burning at Marsden Moor, it almost certainly will have been these axillary buds that then responded, while the scorched original apical buds will probably have been killed off. So it takes a little while, obviously, for these axillary buds then to grow up and take over as the if you like, the canopy of the sphagnum. Now, I mentioned about the spreading branches enabling adjacent plants to transmit water between individual plants. And the key there is, of course, sphagnum doesn't grow as individual plants. It grows as a carpet, as an assemblage of plants. And that's an interesting point in terms of what Tim was talking about in relation to the plugs, but also Tom alluded to it. And I've been having discussion with Neil Wright at Beadamoss about plug size, because the bigger the plug size, the more resilient that plug will be. So from Beadamoss's point of view, there's a sort of commercial decision about, well, how many plants do we put in a plug? If we put more plants, then do we charge a bigger price for a bigger plug or whatever? So there's a number of issues there that in the real world need to be considered. But one could expect, and there is some evidence, that a bigger plug would be more resilient to edge effects and so on, because of these spreading branches enabling the plants to transmit water between each other. And of course, in creating this carpet, this assemblage, they are able to retain whatever moisture falls onto that bog surface. And even though you're on the watershed ridge, this can be the wettest part of the entire site. So it's this water retention that is the characteristic feature of sphagnum. In terms of establishing sphagnum so that it can create these extensive mats, carpets, Evel Gorham and Lynn Rochefort in Canada, in Quebec, they've been doing a lot of work on sphagnum restoration for several decades now, working with the peat industry there. And there are three critical features that they feel will influence whether sphagnum will survive and thrive. So working with colleagues Jonathan Price and Whitehead, what they believe is that you need a high, reasonably constant water table, and by that they mean an average of minus 29 centimeters below the ground surface, with variation of about 14 centimeters. So notice there, it doesn't actually need to be near the surface, but it needs to be close to the surface at the maximum range that they describe, which is interesting in its own right. They talk about soil moisture must be greater than 50%, and soil water pressure should be minus 100 centimeters for the whole season. I'm going to come back to that soil water pressure and also the soil moisture in a little while. So if we have peat that is like this, shallow peat, very dry, you can be fairly confident that this particular piece of peat does not meet any of those three criteria. So we got a dense columnar canopy there, drawing moisture out of the peat. It's shallow. It's in this case, obviously, it's been cut away to create a quarry, and the peat has cracked. It's all very dry. But we also have issues with species that might be competitive for sphagnum. So in this case, on rather similar peat, this is in mid Wales, we have essentially agriculturalized peat that was abandoned. It's really quite shallow. Most of it is less than a meter deep. But it's also really quite dry because they were attempting to drain the ground, and so there are lots of drains in the area. So the peat surface is now sufficiently dry for Reitidiadelphus scorosus to form extensive carpets. Now, this particular moss species grows extremely vigorously. And what we found is that it has a tendency to outgrow any sphagnum that has been planted, and therefore essentially smother the sphagnum. But this Reitidiadelphus can only survive and grow vigorously because the hydrological conditions are not yet right. None of the drains have been blocked up. The peat is really quite dry. So this moss species isn't necessarily a serious competitor, provided you can get the hydrology right. But it is an indicator that you haven't got the hydrology right. And hypnum can be the same. Big carpets of hypnum can outcompete sphagnum if conditions are right, if conditions are more similar to dry heath than to peatland. So here, this is a view across this ground. We also have polytrichum, which again is doing better than the sphagnum plugs at the moment. So certain vigorous moss species can be outcompeting, but it's really an indication you haven't got the conditions right yet. So I mentioned soil moisture, and Anthony was talking about digibog hydro and the water table. And the water table is important. But one of the really critical features of peat, the really unusual features of peat, is its ability to hold moisture. So even when the water table falls, the peat above the water table will still be extremely moist. It'll still have a high moisture content. And sphagnum is able to draw on that. So purely focusing on water table behavior may not be giving us the full story here. Remember those pendant branches? If they are able to draw moisture up from the high moisture zone, even though the water table may be lower, and that high moisture zone, if you're dealing with Sphagnum capillifolium, for example, could be as much as 30 centimeters into the peat. Your sphagnum could still be healthy. And measuring water table is a very expensive or labor-intensive process. Either you need water level, continuous water level recorders, or you need dip wells and someone has to go out and measure them regularly. But actually we found a simple moisture meter used for pot plants can be an extremely useful indicator of where the high moisture zone is sitting within the peat. And after various testing, we found that when you push these probes, they're only 15 pounds from Amazon, when you push the probe into the peat and the needle flicks up to the blue zone, the beginning of the blue zone, that is an indication of where the high moisture zone is, even if the water table is much lower. So what I'm proposing is that this is something that can be used to supplement things like digibog hydro models to enable people to judge whether they've got an area that might be suitable for sphagnum planting, particularly if the high moisture zone is quite low, then you might want to be thinking about species that are more hummock species rather than pool species. And we use this for my condition matrix, where we identify the different microtopographic features based on where the high moisture zone is, not where the water table is. So the other thing that I mentioned was precipitation. Obviously, bogs rely entirely on precipitation. But what we've tended to focus on is rainfall. And I would argue there is another important component of precipitation that is poorly considered, almost never measured. In fact, it's really difficult to measure, but is absolutely important, crucial for sphagnum hydrology. So this is taken from Dickie Climo's chapter. And what he's looking at is the axis at the bottom of this diagram is essentially soil pore water pressure. And what he shows is the water mass per dry unit mass of the plant as the plant dries out. And you can see that there's a very clear step in this graph. And that step is where the pores within the sphagnum leaf actually respond to the presence or absence of moisture. And that value, you can see, is close to minus 100 kPa, but that's basically 100 centimeters, minus 100 centimeters. That was mentioned by Gorham and Rochefort. So if we look at the sphagnum leaves and the cell structure of these leaves, we can see all these pores throughout the leaf. And if we zoom in, we can see that the crosshair, what look like crosshairs within the leaves, these are actually spiral thickening. And that spiral thickening prevents the hyaline water storage cells from collapsing when there's no water in there. But by doing that, they create an enormous suction pressure. And these pores are open. So these pores can just grab any moisture that's around and draw that into the hyaline cells. And so dew and fog, hill fog, occult precipitation can be an extremely important source of moisture for sphagnum, simply because these open pores with these huge suction pressures just waiting to grab any moisture. So again, this is from Dickie Climo's chapter, and he put different sphagnum species into a totally dry environment. And then after a certain number of days, he tested a sample of these individual plants to see what survival rate there was. And we can see that there's quite a variation in survival. Sphagnum fimbriatum really only survived 3 days of total desiccation, whereas Sphagnum imbricatum or Austini, 100% survival, despite being in totally dry conditions for more than 16 days. So that's important when we think about drought conditions, because drought conditions occur when we have very dry, hot, dry days. And yet you speak to any sailor and they will tell you that a hot, dry day will then result in heavy dewfall on the deck of their boat. Heavy dewfall is a very characteristic feature of hot, dry days. Heavy dewfall is something that sphagnum can use. So actually, when we have these meteorological droughts where there hasn't been any rain for 20 days, the sphagnum may not have noticed because it may have been taking advantage of the dewfall every night during that whole period. So it hasn't experienced drought. It's been growing quite happily. And then finally, there's shade. Again, taken from the Dickie Climo chapter. What he looked at was the impact of water table depth and shade on growth in mass and growth in length. And the last sentence in the caption here says, water table depth had little effect on growth in mass, which is quite interesting as a result. But he then produces these rather nice graphs which show growth in length of 3 species of sphagnum in experiments, water table and shade. So shade is this axis and water table depth is this axis. So if we look at Sphagnum capillifolium, and we look at the amount of shade, percentage of full daylight, we actually find that there is better growth of Sphagnum capillifolium at round about 46% full daylight. Sphagnum papillosum is actually down at about 20% full daylight. Shade is not an issue for sphagnum. It's perfectly capable of growing in really very dense shade. And this is a photo from Japan. This is Sasa, which is kind of the Japanese equivalent of heather. And you can see you've got this continuous carpet of sphagnum beneath the Sasa, and it was so dark in there that my camera flash went off automatically. So just to conclude, I think, as was already mentioned, dense columnar cover is not a problem for sphagnum as long as the soil moisture is adequate. Rainfall, drought periods, not necessarily a problem as long as you're having heavy dewfall. And we really need to get a better handle on this occult precipitation input, which could explain to a large extent examples of sphagnum survival in areas where people are saying, well, you know, we really don't think they should survive. And that paper that Tom mentioned by Johnny Ritson, I'm writing another paper with him at the moment, sorting Johnny out a bit. What that paper actually says is, yes, there may be issues to do with water supply, but actually some species of sphagnum may survive, may do better under these drier conditions because they're adapted to these conditions. But that part isn't featured in the abstract. So people read the paper and think, oh my God, we're doomed. But actually, I've been making the point since to Johnny that actually occult precipitation, soil moisture, can actually keep our sphagnum going, and it's something that isn't considered within Johnny's model. So on that point, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was brilliant. I would like to thank all of our speakers today for their brilliant presentations. And I would also like to highlight that the IUCN UK Peatland programme recently commissioned a film called Sphagnum Portraits, that also shares the work of Beadamoss and Moors for the Future. And this film is available on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested, have a look. So we will be swiftly moving on to the Q&A session. And I believe my colleague Jess should be ready with the first question.